The Haunting of Bly Manor, the follow-up to The Haunting of Hill House, is good, yes, but I am going to have to immediately address the one thing that everyone, at least everyone in this country, has been talking about. The incredibly wonky accents. If you're American, you may not have noticed this, but as an English person, it can be incredibly distracting. Actors putting on accents isn't always a problem, of course. Renee Zellweger is fine as Bridget Jones, but someone really should have caught this when casting for Bly Manor, because the grating accents are a problem with multiple characters, and it made it harder than it should have been to get invested in what is admittedly a highly compelling story. Peter Quint's Scottish accent has had the most amount of criticism, of course, which is odd because Oliver Jackson Cohen is actually English, but I mostly had this problem with the narrator and Henry Wingrave, both of whom speak with the kind of broad, affected English accent that Americans would probably assume sounds genuine, but English people can just tell that they're putting it on. They sound like they're doing the telephone voice all of the time. You know how when you answer the phone you speak much more fluently than usual? Well, I always do. Hello, insert name of company I work for here, Stuart speaking, how may I help you? But away from the phone, your voice lapses, your pronunciation gets a bit lazier, maybe you drop the odd T here and there because people can't be totally 100% polite and well-spoken all the bloody time because it's way too much effort. I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm dirt common. Maybe you need to have gone to Eton for Bly Manor to sound like a genuine appropriation of Britain by an American production. Their pronunciation is just a bit too solid. It's like everyone's being played by Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, that being said, even though I really wanted to wander around this set sellotaping people's mouths shut one by one, the fact that there is a sense of the uncanny valley to Bly Manor's depiction of Britain can work in its favour. The fact that everything feels just a bit out of place unsettles the viewer. It makes you feel like what you're watching isn't quite right, because it's not just the accents. It's mostly set in 1986, and yet it feels like an amalgamation of about 6 or 7 different decades all playing at once. The children are strange, surreal, and feel like they're more from the 1930s. And this can help to foster the disconcerting atmosphere that you need when you're trying to tell a story like this. And speaking of said story, let's talk about that. Spoiler warning. So, new au pair Danny Clayton has to look after a pair of creepy children whose parents died tragically. They live at Bly Manor, a perfectly normal mansion in the countryside that contains no supernatural entities whatsoever. Oh wait, sorry, I read that wrong. Haunted house. Bly Manor is structured very differently to Hill House. Hill House was more of an anthology series whose stories combined to create one big picture. Bly Manor is more like a novel. It's got a through line, but the narrative will just sort of drift in and out of flashbacks and backstories, and said flashbacks and backstories aren't always the focus of the episodes. Some of them are. Episode 5 is totally Hannah's story, Episode 8 is a full-on flashback, but it doesn't always do this, and the fact the narrative doesn't totally rigidly separate its focal points by episode again means that it does end up feeling a bit messier than Hill House. Episode 2, for example, is called The Pupil, and it appears to be dedicated to Miles and how he got expelled from school. But the story of how he got expelled from school is pretty much over by the midpoint, and then we're back at the house doing more Danny and Jamie stuff in the second half. It's as if they wrote out Miles' story, but then they realised that there wasn't enough story and there was still time left to fill. So the episode then sort of ends up going, and then another thing happened! And this is kind of a running problem with Bly Manor because its story is much more noticeably compact than Hill House's, and yet it's still 9 episodes long. Hill House's episodes followed each of the characters as kids experiencing trauma and as adults dealing with said trauma. They had multiple periods of the characters' lives to cover and that justified the length, whereas Miles is a kid and stays a kid throughout the series and hasn't really lived much of a life yet, and so his character's relationship with the supernatural goings-on is much thinner than, say, Nell's, who's lived an entire life being haunted by this shit. There just isn't as much to do with as many of these characters, and so a 9-hour series doesn't really make as much sense here. Part of it could be because as an adaptation of source material, Bly Manor is much more recognisable as the book it's based on, The Turn of the Screw, than The Haunting of Hill House was as an adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House. And The Turn of the Screw, while it is a masterpiece of gothic horror, and it is much more complex than it seems on first glance, it is quite a compact story that doesn't really require 9 hours hours of television. So Bly Manor has bolted bits onto it and woven in some backstory, and that's where we come to the problem of explaining everything again. The Turn of the Screw is very ambiguous when it comes to its supernatural activity. That's one of the things it's famous for. After having seen the spectres of Quint and Jessel around the manor, it ends with the governess seeing Peter Quint in the window, and then Miles dies in the governess's arms. And one reading of this is in doubting whether the ghostly presence at Bly Manor was even real in the first place. The book could be a case of the unreliable narrator. That's why the story is presented as a written account that's been found by a third party. The governess could have killed Miles herself, her sanity could have been a factor. And The Haunting of Bly Manor could have played into this reading of it. Doubting the sanity of our main characters kind of fits as a follow-up to Hill House, because Hill House spent most of its runtime blurring the lines between sanity and the supernatural right up until the ending. And I can't help but feel like Bly Manor demystifying the weird goings-on again might take away from the effect of the series rather than add to it. Though the exploration of the mechanics of Peter Quint's ghostdom and how he makes Miss Jessel follow him is fun, don't get me wrong, as is the full flashback in episode 8 telling the story of the house's original owners, which is a beautiful, highly compelling gothic tale of death, disease and betrayal. It's just the fact it's less ambiguous than the book means that I just found it a bit less, well, haunting. This is not to say watching this ghostly lady at the bottom of the lake returning to the house night after night and losing her face over the years is not utterly terrifying, because it very much is. Just as an image, this holds up really well. I also love the fact The Haunting of Bly Manor has retained Hill House's unrestrained emotional nastiness. I love the tale of Viola's prolonged illness and refusal to go quietly, and how Perdita gets pushed over the edge into doing something unforgivable, and how she fights her way through to an act of revenge from beyond the grave. The standout episode, of course, is Hannah Gross's episode, where she flashes back and forth throughout the years, and it feels like her reality's collapsing. This is the one that's most reminiscent of the finale of Hill House, with all the character flashbacks and distorted realities that jump out at you and jerk you out of a false sense of security. Characters who we've been friendly with the whole time take sudden, dark, malevolent turns over the course of the runtime before we reveal that big twist. Also, while I'm here, this episode really set me in mind of one of my favourite movies, the 2001 period horror movie called The Others, which was also heavily inspired by The Turn of the Screw, and really, it's one of the finest movies, not just in the horror genre, but in general. More people need to have seen The Others, and if you take anything away from this video, it's this recommendation. Go watch it now. The only episode that didn't really work at all for me, though, was the final one. The series feels like it's ended, and yet Danny keeps on seeing reflections of the Faceless Lady. I think this probably would have been stronger if we'd flipped the order around and this had happened prior to the flashback episode. There'd be this great symmetry between Danny being haunted by someone who she knows, Edmund, and them being haunted by a faceless woman who she and the audience don't know. There'd just be something mysterious and terrifying about her seeing reflections of this strange unknown monster and it leading her to drown herself in the lake. It could just be me here, but I just felt like demystifying the Faceless Lady before this episode kinda ruined the effect. I mean, I suppose this is doing more connection between ghosts and trauma here, but I'd kind of already had my fill of Danny trauma by this point with the Edmund episode, which is exceptionally good. It's the one that's most similar to the character-centric episodes from Hill House, where we fully flesh out a character as we rake over their pasts over the course of the runtime and combine that with supernatural activity. This formula has been proven by the team behind it to work really well. It's extremely emotionally affecting and makes the ghosts much more meaningful. This scene here where she sees Edmund in the mirror at the funeral was probably one of the finest moments in the show. Anyway, overall, don't get me wrong with anything I've said here. Bly Manor was a very enjoyable follow-up to Hill House, but please people, don't pretend like it hasn't got its problems. I know that people are hesitant to acknowledge problems anymore because Netflix is the most unreliable media company ever when it comes to recommissioning series that deserve it, and I really want this series in particular to go on for as long as possible. I'm salivating at the thought of what we're going to get next, but when you compare the two side by side, Bly Manor is noticeably messier than Hill House. And if you're hesitant to acknowledge what the show needs to build on because of Netflix's unreliability as an entertainment provider, if you do that, then it won't bode well for future series, even if they do get commissioned. Just saying.